Okay, welcome back again. Okay, I hope everybody is holding up well under the circumstances. Here we are, a good month into our school closure and our stay-at-home order and some isolation time. And that's why we're doing these videos. You know, ideally, we'd be at school together and we'd be talking about these and you'd be asking me questions. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about before we get started now on chapter 14. You are probably, if you're doing this right, you're going to have questions. You're going to have things that don't make sense or that you don't understand or you're not sure about. The best thing you could do is either send me an email or come to one of our Zoom meetings and ask me a question and and let me answer it for you. I'm not the only authority though. You can use those summaries that I sent with you. You can get on the internet and find other folks who explain the novel Treasure Island because it's a classic. It's been around for a very long time and a lot of people know about it. A lot of people have talked about it. So get lots of opinions and ideas from other people to help you understand it. You don't want to feel like lost in this. It's a hard book. It's hard on purpose. Let's not forget that. We're doing something difficult because we want to grow as readers and not stay the same. If we read something so easy that we didn't need it explained to us, then we would be, reading for fun. And reading for fun is good. Do that. And you can even read hard books for fun if you want to and get help with them if you get lost in it. But this isn't entirely that. Though Treasure Island is a fun story, it's not the kind of book you just pick up and read without any help. It's one that you should get some help. Sorry about that. That was my dog. That was Carlo. It's a good reminder that we're doing this in circumstances that aren't perfect, right? Yeah. Okay, so hopefully Carlo will let us read this next chapter. We're on chapter 14, and this one's called The First Blow. And sometimes when you are about to read things or talk about things that are disturbing, it's always a good idea to give people a bit of a warning, right? In this chapter, some pretty bad, awful things happen. And I apologize ahead of time because when we read about bad people doing bad things, it can make us feel bad about bad things in our own lives, or even just things that we imagine to be bad. Some people like scary movies, some people don't. Some people like violence in stories, and some people don't. And personally, I think that if it is for no purpose, violence is awful to have to deal with. But this is a story about pirates, and let's not forget that pirates are not good guys. Johnny Depp might seem pretty cool in Pirates of the Caribbean, but people whose main job was to kill people and take their money, no, they're not good guys. And this is the chapter where we really get to see that in action the first time, and it's called The First Blow. Okay, so I'm going to read it to you. I want you to keep your notes nearby. You can take notes as we go. You can jot things down. You can pause the video and write something. Just make sure that you are connecting with what you read. There's a lot of dialogue, which makes it a little hard to understand. In Treasure Island, some of the most challenging parts are the dialogue, especially when the pirates are talking, because they use a lot of slang and a lot of kind of a dialect, almost like they have an accent. So pay attention, get the parts out of it that you know, and then piece together, bigger understanding of what's going on from the little bits that you do know. And then ask questions when you get lost. Okay? All right, here we go. The first blow. I was so pleased at having given the slip to Long John that I began to enjoy myself and look around me with some interest on the strange land that I was in. I had crossed a marshy tract full of willows, bulrushes, and odd, outlandish, swampy trees, and I had now come out upon the skirts of an open piece of undulating, sandy country, about a mile long, dotted with a few pines and a great number of contorted trees, not unlike the oak in growth, but pale in the foliage, like willows. On the far side of the open stood one of the hills, with two quaint, craggy peaks shining vividly in the sun. I now felt for the first time the joy of exploration. The isle was uninhabited. My shipmates I had left behind, and nothing lived in front of me but dumb brutes and fowls. I turned hither and thither among the trees. Here and there were flowering plants, unknown to me. Here and there I saw snakes, and one raised his head from a ledge of rock and hissed at me with a noise not unlike the spitting of a top. Little did I suppose that he was a deadly enemy, and that the noise was the famous rattle. Then I came to a long thicket of these oak-like trees, live or evergreen oaks. I heard afterwards that they should be called, which grew low along the sand like brambles, the boughs curiously twisted, the foliage compact like thatch. The thicket stretched down from the top of one of the sandy knolls, spreading and growing taller as it went, until it reached the margin of the broad, reedy fen, through which the nearest of the little rivers soaked its way into the anchorage. The marsh was steaming in the strong sun, and the outline of the spyglass trembled through the haze. All at once there began to go a sort of bustle among the bulrushes. A wild duck flew up with a quack, another followed, and soon over the whole surface of the marsh a great cloud of birds hung screaming and circling in the air. I judged at once that some of my shipmates must be drawing near along the borders of the fen. Nor was I deceived, for soon I heard the very distant and low tones of a human voice, which, as I continued to give ear, grew steadily louder and nearer. Okay, a fen is a swamp, and this is a swampy area next to where the shoreline is, where the boat is anchored. So it's a swampy place, okay? This put me in a great fear, and I crawled under cover of the nearest live oak and squatted there, hearkening, as silent as a mouse. Another voice answered, and then the first voice, which I now recognized to be Silver's, once more took up the story and ran on for a long while in a stream, only now and again interrupted by the other. By the sound, they must have been talking earnestly and almost fiercely, but no distinct word came to my hearing. At last the speakers seemed to have paused and perhaps to have sat down, for not only did they cease to draw any nearer, but the birds themselves began to grow more quiet and to settle again to their places in the swamp. And now I began to feel that I was neglecting my business, that since I had been so foolhardy as to come ashore with these desperadoes, the least I could do was to overhear them at their councils, and that my plain and obvious duty was to draw as close as I could manage under the favorable ambush of the crouching trees. So he's decided that he's going to go listen in. I could tell the direction of the speakers pretty exactly, not only by the sound of their voices, but by the behavior of the few birds that still hung in alarm above the heads of the intruders. Crawling on all fours, I made steadily but slowly towards them, till at last, raising my head to an aperture among the leaves, I could see clear down into a little green dell beside the marsh, and closely set about with trees, where Long John Silver and another of the crew stood face to face in conversation. The sun beat full upon them. Silver had thrown his hat beside him on the ground, and his great, smooth, blonde face, all shining with heat, was lifted to the other man's in a kind of appeal. "Mate," he was saying, "it's because I thinks gold dust of ye, gold dust, and you may lay to that. If I hadn't took to you like pitch, do you think I'd have been here a warning of ye? All's up. You can't make nor mend. It's to save your neck that I'm a-speaking. And if one of the wild uns knew it, where'd I be, Tom? Now tell me, where'd I be?" "Silver," said the other man, and I observed he was not only red in the face, but spoke as hoarse as a crow, and his voice shook, too, like a tightrope. "Silver," says he, "you're old and you're honest, or has the name for it, and you've money, too, which lots of poor sailors hasn't, and you're brave, or I mistook. And will you tell me you'll let yourself be led away with that kind of mess of swabs? Not you. As sure as God sees me, I'd sooner lose my hand if I turn again my duty." And then all of a sudden he was interrupted by a noise. I had found one of the honest hands. Well, here, at the same moment, came news of another. Far away out in the marsh, there arose all of a sudden a sound like the cry of anger. Then another on the back of it, and then one horrid, long-drawn scream. The rocks of the spyglass re-echoed it a score of times. The whole troop of marsh birds rose again, darkening heaven, with a simultaneous whir, And long after that death yell was still ringing in my brain, silence had reestablished its empire, and only the rustle of the redescending birds and the boom of the distant surges disturbed the languor of the afternoon. Okay, let me help you understand what just was heard. Okay, first of all, we have these two people talking. One of them is Long John Silver, and the other one he addresses as Tom. So he's talking to a sailor named Tom. And Silver's saying, look, I really like you. That's why I'm taking time to warn you. You know, he says things like, I think gold dust up you, which means I really like you. And I'm just trying to warn you. And the other guy's like, you're not going to really, hang out with these guys. These are bad guys. I would never want to hang out with these guys. So this is one of the honest guys. That's what Jim is saying. I found one of the honest hands. And then I heard news of another. And what he hears in the distance is a terrible series of screams. One long, horrid scream. And he calls it a death yell. So he hears somebody sounding like they're being killed in the distance. Okay, now back to the story here. Tom had leaped at the sound like a horse at the spur, but Silver had not winked an eye. He stood where he was, resting lightly on his crutch, watching his companion like a snake about to spring. John, said the sailor, stretching out his hand. Hands off, cried Silver, leaping back a yard, as it seemed to me, with the speed and security of a trained gymnast. Hands off if you like, John Silver, said the other. It's a black conscience that can make you feared of me. But in heaven's name, tell me, what was that? That, returned Silver, smiling away, but warier than ever, his eye a mere pinpoint in his big face, but gleaming like a crumb of glass. That, oh, I reckon that'll be Alan. And at this point, Tom flashed out like a hero. Alan, he cried, then rest his soul for a true seaman. And as for you, John Silver, long you've been a mate of mine, but you're mate of mine no more. If I die like a dog, I'll die in my duty. You've killed Alan, have you? Kill me too if you can, but I defies you. And with that, this brave fellow turned his back directly on the cook and set off walking for the beach. But he was not destined to go far. With a cry, John seized the branch of a tree, whipped the crutch out of his armpit, and sent that uncouth missile hurtling through the air. It struck poor Tom, point foremost, and with stunning violence right between the shoulders of the middle of his back. His hands flew up. He gave a sort of gasp and fell. Whether he were injured much or little, none could ever tell. Like enough to judge from the sound, his back was broken on the spot. But he had no time given him to recover. Silver, agile as a monkey, even without leg or crutch, was on the top of him next moment and had twice buried his knife up to the hilt in that defenseless body. From my place of ambush, I could hear him pant aloud as he struck the blows. I do not know what it rightly is to faint, but I do know that for the next little while, the whole world swam away from before me in a whirling mist. Silver and the birds and the tall spyglass hilltop going round, and topsy-turvy before my eyes, and all manner of bells ringing and distant voices shouting in my ear. When I came again to myself, the monster had pulled himself together, his crutch under his arm, his hat upon his head. Just before him, Tom lay motionless upon the sward, but the murderer minded him not a whit, cleansing his blood-stained knife, the while upon a wisp of grass. Everything else was unchanged, the sun still shining mercilessly on the steaming marsh, and the tall pinnacle of the mountain, and I could scarce persuade myself that murder had been actually done, and a human life cruelly cut short a moment since before my eyes. But now John put his hand into his pocket, brought out a whistle, and blew upon it several modulated blasts that rang far across the heated air. I could not tell, of course, the meaning of the signal, but it instantly awoke my fears. More men would be coming. I might be discovered. They had already slain 2 of the honest people. After Tom and Alan, might not I come next? Instantly, I began to extricate myself and crawl back again, with what speed and silence I could manage, to the more open portion of the wood. As I did so, I could hear hails coming and going between the old buccaneer and his comrades, and the sound of danger lent me wings. As soon as I was clear of the thicket, I ran as I never ran before, scarce minding the direction of my flight, so long as it led me from the murderers. And as I ran, fear grew and grew upon me until it turned into a kind of frenzy. Indeed, could anyone be more entirely lost than I? When the gun fired, how should I dare to go down to the boats among those fiends still smoking from their crime? Would not the first of them who saw me wring my neck like a snipe's? Would not my absence itself be an evidence to them of my alarm and therefore of my fatal knowledge? It was all over, I thought. Goodbye to the Hispaniola, goodbye to the squire, the doctor, and the captain. There was nothing left for me but death by starvation or death by the hands of the mutineers. All this while, as I say, I was still running, and without taking any notice, I had drawn near to the foot of the little hill with the 2 peaks, and had got into a part of the island where the live oaks grew more widely apart and seemed more like forest trees in their bearing and dimensions. Mingled with these were a few scattered pines, some 50, some near 70 feet high. The air, too, smelt more freshly than down beside the marsh, and here a fresh alarm brought me to a standstill with a thumping heart. Wow. Okay, so this chapter, we have really seen a change in events, right? So it's one thing to know that Long John Silver is a bad guy, but to see him commit murder before your eyes is very traumatic, and Jim is traumatized. Okay, so he sneaks up and he watches Long John talk to a man named Tom, and they hear a yell like somebody dying. The man is like, who is that? And he's panicking, he's scared. And Long John's like smiling at him like, guess that's Alan. And so the Tom guy's like, oh my God, I whatever, I'm not going to be one of you, and starts to walk off. And Long John, this one-legged guy, remember he wears a lanyard so his crutch is around his neck when he's not using it, but now it's under his arm. Okay, he's got one crutch and one leg. He grabs a branch with one of his arms. I don't know. He grabs a branch with one of his arms and takes his crutch and throws it at Tom's back. The point of the crutch hits Tom in the middle of the back, and you hear a crack. Tom falls down, and one-legged Long John, like a gymnast, Jim says, hops over, takes his knife, and stabs Tom to death. And Jim watches that. And Jim faints. Everything just goes in front of him, and he takes him a minute to pull it together. And then he realizes he could be next. And he probably would be next, because if they see him, they'll know that he knows too much. And if he tries to go back to the Hispaniola, they'll know and they'll catch him. So he's either going to die because of the pirates, or he's going to run away on this island and die because he's lost and abandoned on an island. So he's panicking. And so he just starts running. And at the very end of this chapter, it leaves you kind of hanging, because he's scared of something new now, because he hears something or sees something. Who knows? So get out your notes page. Write a summary of what just happened. Think about what just happened and how you would feel if you were Jim right now. All through this book, you should be thinking about that. Jim's about your age, and he's going through some horrendous things. Personal tragedies, scary things, exciting things, maybe even fun things. This is not fun. Seeing somebody get murdered in front of his eyes, that's just one more horrible trauma that he's having to go through. And now he's stuck on this island with the very people that he should be fearing the most. This is a tough time for Jim. So what possibly could be happening that also scares him on top of all of that? Well, that's something that we're going to find out in chapter 15. Don't forget, fill out your whole page, the whole page, the summary, the wondering, the what was hard, all of that. Fill out what the characters are doing. Okay, there are definitely 3 that you should be following here: Jim, Long John, and Tom. are the folks that you need to be aware of. I do want to, just as a side note, this is a really good time to mention this, that this character Tom, this is the only time that he shows up. It's kind of unfortunate because Tom is a very common name in the time period that is being written about. It's just a common name. And so there is another Tom in the story, Tom Redruth. And Tom Redruth gets talked about in the next few chapters quite extensively. So they are not the same person. Okay, you got Tom, who was just killed by Long John Silver, and then there's Tom Redruth, and that's a whole other situation. So be aware that there are two Toms. Just keep that in mind. Okay, I will see you again soon, and we will read chapter 15 next. See you then.